Hi everybody, good evening and welcome to this month's webinar on APA editing and how to avoid common mistakes. To start out, I'm just going to go over a few of the logistics of how to use this webinar. My name is Nicole Crevar. I'm the Senior APA Editor here at Statistics Solutions. So we're going to be going over different errors that I commonly see when I'm editing dissertations, working with different feedback, and obviously all of the basics of APA editing. While we're going through the webinar, please note that this is going to be recorded, and we do have an archive on our website. I'll pull it up. These are all free to access at any time. If you also look on the right side of the webinar, there is a pane that has a chat and questions options. If you look in the chat, I'm going to post the link that you can follow to go to the archive of all of our webinars. Throughout the presentation, I will have a few other links that I'm going to share, so I will post them here in the chat section. In addition, if you guys have any questions while I'm going through all of my information, you can write them in the questions pane over here on the right. I'm going to wait till the end, however, to answer all of your questions. If for some reason time doesn't allow and I'm not able to get to everybody's questions, I will respond to all of them via email. We have your emails on file, so don't worry, your questions will be answered. Okay, so we're going to get started. First, I'd like to go over just some basics of grammar and style. One of the biggest issues I find when I'm reading through dissertations is the difference between active and passive voice. A lot of different reviewers and committees prefer active voice, and this is also an APA requirement. So, what is the difference? If you see here, I have a couple examples. Passive voice, the sentence here is, the study was conducted in a controlled setting. The reason why APA does not want you to use this type of writing is because it is unclear who the doer of the action is in the sentence, who conducted the study. This just creates clearer writing when you say the researcher or I. Using third or first voice is also another issue that just depends on a school-to-school basis. APA doesn't have a recommendation. They say, you know, if you're going to say the researcher, continue using the researcher throughout the paper. And vice versa, if you're going to use I and refer to yourself in first person, continue using that throughout the paper as well. You just want to keep it consistent. That's kind of one of the biggest themes throughout the APA manual is just consistency. But again, this is a school-specific requirement, so you will need to check with your guidelines on that. In referring to active voice, so throughout most of your paper, you're going to use active voice. I found, I conducted, or the researcher found. But there are instances of passive voice that will occur, and there are times that you cannot eliminate passive voice. There are a few different sections on this in the manual that you can go over. But most of the time, you'll find passive voice in chapters 3 and 4 when you want to have an emphasis on the participants. Say, the example in the book is the president was shot. So the emphasis here is on the president, not who shot the president, because the president, you know, is an important person. The same goes for your study. You're focusing on your participants and the importance of your participants. So the action is placed on them. So you will find passive voice in chapter 3 and 4. Sometimes your reviewer might flag this, but definitely go back to the APA manual. Always use that as your guide. And to fix passive sentences, so say you've already completed a chapter, you know, you're stressed out writing it, got it done, you realize you have a lot of passive voice. To fix them, you would just go back and change them to put the doer of action. So the researchers found instead of the study was finding, which we'll go over anthropomorphism a little bit next, but basically you want to put the doer of action in the sentence always. This creates clearer writing. So as I previously said, we're going to go over a little bit of anthropomorphism. This is a big word, and it also comes up a lot throughout your dissertations. I've noticed it a lot when students are saying, either referring to their own study or referring to what other researchers have done or found. So anthropomorphism is the act of attributing human characteristics to inanimate objects or ideas. This includes the study found, the study showed, the study will, conduct. The reason that this is a problem is because it is unclear, again, you kind of have that who is the doer of the action, but it's also an inanimate object. A study cannot find something. It's not a human, it's not a person. So you want to fix that. You want to put, the researcher found, or Smith and Jones found, instead of, this information was found. Again, eliminating the passive voice, eliminating the anthropomorphism. And the biggest time, just as this example shows, the biggest time I see this is when someone says the researcher found or the study found. Those are big no-nos, and you will get flagged for the anthropomorphism. Throughout my slides, just as a side note, you'll also see at the top that I list the page numbers where you can find this information in the APA manual as well, just as your own guide, and just to back up everything that I'm saying here. The manual does provide more examples. In addition, there is an APA style blog, which I will show you a few sites from moving forward. But the APA style blog also kind of fleshes things out a little more. They give more examples, and there's also a forum where you can ask questions as well. Continuing on with just some different basics, I want to touch a little bit on tense use. So we've got passive voice down, anthropomorphism, and now we just want to make sure we're writing in the correct tense. Again, sometimes these rules are school dependent, but generally speaking, I'm going to review what APA prefers and what I've found just editing dissertations. So generally, when you're in the proposal stage, that's chapters 1 through 3, before you start data collection, you want it to be in the present and future tense when referring to your own study. So I will, or I plan to, will conduct, things like that. You want to keep it in the future. You can also say this study is, or the point of this study is, something along those lines. Then when you move forward, after your proposal is approved and you get URR approval, you're starting to collect your data, you're moving on to chapters 4 and 5. You want to convert all 1 through 3 to past tense. So you'll have to go back, read through 1 through 3, change everything to past tense. The researcher found, the study was, the premise was, the etc. Put it all into past tense. The reason for this is when you're done and you have a published, finalized product, it shows everything you did and found and conducted, and you definitely don't want to have conflicting verbs because it will completely throw off the reader's understanding and clarity while they're going through your document. I have a couple examples here as well. When you're referring to other researchers, so I have an example here, Smith found, Smith stated, you want to make sure that those are always in past tense because the research is complete, it's not ongoing, everything that you're quoting and citing is done. I know this is different and varies across different style guides, but per APA, it's all in past tense. So therefore, once you finish your project, really all of your verbs are going to be in past tense, except for the few, I will delete the data 5 years after my study's published, depending on your school guidelines. So you will still have a few future verbs, but generally stick to past tense. Next, I'm going to focus a little bit on capitalization. This is another common error I see quite frequently when going through dissertations. A lot of people tend to overuse capitalization is what I find, capitalizing theories and models, or just not knowing what APA's rules are, because they are a little different, and of course there are many and there are exceptions, so it definitely gets a little confusing when you're working through. Okay, so I'm going to flesh out when to do it and when not to do it, and then I'm going to show you a couple different links you can use to just kind of back up your studies in your writing. So when to do it. Major words in titles and headings, including all words of 4 letters or more. I see this frequently as an error in table titles. People don't capitalize the word with. It is 4 letters or more, so per APA it has to be capitalized, even though technically it's kind of like an article word, a smaller word, but per APA, again, capitalize anything more than 4 letters. Next, we have journal titles. This will show up sometimes in your literature review when you're listing titles of different journals that you've accessed, or in your reference list. So when you have, the International Journal of Medicine, that will be capitalized and italicized, but capitalization definitely want to have there. References of titles of sections within the same article or document. So what this refers to is, say you're in your chapter 1, your introduction, and you're writing about something that you'll talk more about in the limitations section or the literature review. When you're referring to a section in your paper, you want to capitalize that. So say you say, as shown in my literature review, the L and the R would be capitalized. Pretty basic, but it's just kind of to designate that you're referring to a section in your own paper and not just like generally talking about a literature review. Next, we have proper nouns, adjectives, and nouns used as proper nouns, and trade names. Proper nouns is pretty common, so, referring to Freud or, a different researcher, or the Belmont report. Belmont would be capitalized, as would report because it's a document. Different examples just kind of depend on your study. They're very study specific, sorry. So you definitely want to pay attention to that, but proper nouns is a pretty general rule. Nouns followed by numerals or letters is another APA standard. So participant 1, step 2, item 5. Different examples like that. I know this is something people definitely get tripped up on because it's not common to capitalize that word before the number, but it is an APA rule requirement. So I did want to point it out. And probably one of the biggest things I find with capitalization errors is using theories or models and questionnaires, inventories, different statistical tools. So with titles of tests, inventories, and questionnaires, as I have listed here, they are capitalized. An example, a common one, is the multi-factor leadership questionnaire. Every time you mention that in your document, you're going to capitalize each word of that. In addition, we have Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. The list really goes on, but the reason I wanted to show you this is because when we get on to things you do not capitalize, theories and models fall into that category, which definitely gets confusing. What's the difference between capitalizing a theory and an inventory? So in APA, other things you do not want to capitalize are titles of books or articles in your reference list. So in your reference list, which we'll flesh out a little bit more later, you're going to have author, date, and then title of your article, your journal, your book, etc. Only the first word, and after a colon, an em dash, or a semicolon, or a proper noun, as we already stated, are capitalized. So the majority of your titles in your reference list are not capitalized. I have an example here for you. You'll see the authors, the date, strategic beginnings, the title is capitalized, and then after the colon we have leveraging capitalized. And then it goes on, and then I also have the journal title, IBM Systems Journals. That is also capitalized, as we mentioned in the last slide. Other capitalization would include indented paragraphs, headings. You only want to capitalize the first letter of the first word, unless, again, it's a proper noun or a name of an inventory or questionnaire. The APA Level 3 heading is when it's part of the paragraph and it's indented in bold. And you can look that up in the APA manual. They have a nice list in the book, or, of course, the APA style blog, which is much easier to access since you can just Google it real quick. Moving on, names of laws, theories, models, statistical procedures, or hypotheses, none of those are capitalized as well as generic tests of titles. So to kind of reiterate this a little bit more and give you a different way to look at this, APA Style Guide has a blog on capitalization. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit because it's kind of, just so you can see a little better. And in this blog, do I capitalize this word? They have a really great table that breaks everything down for you. What to capitalize? So here we have examples. Freud, Skinner. Those are names of proper nouns. But common nouns, you wouldn't capitalize the author or the investigator. Some of these are pretty obvious. Some are a little really APA specific and nitpicky, such as test and inventory. You would capitalize Beck's depression inventory, but if it's just a depression inventory, you would not capitalize it. So this chart's really great and gives you different examples that you can use when moving through your dissertation. In addition, they have what not to capitalize. And the charts are nice. They give you a visual representation. If you just want to look something up real quick, you can access this link, look at the blog, look at the table, and you should be able to answer your question fairly quickly. Okay. Next, I want to touch on abbreviations and acronyms a little bit. This is another common error, again, I see throughout the dissertation. There are both errors that occur with overuse and underuse. So with overuse, you want to make sure that you're not having so many abbreviations that the clarity of your writing and the meaning gets lost. This occurs a lot in medical dissertations, nursing, or technical fields, when you're talking about just medical abbreviations. It's very common for you in your field and your practice, but for other people who are maybe still interested in your study or want to apply it to their study in the future, it might get really bogged down if every other sentence you're using acronyms. There's also an error that occurs with underuse. So say you refer to an acronym once or twice, it's kind of what makes it important that it really needs to show the acronym. I have an example here, which is pretty common again, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. You'll see this a lot, again, in medical papers. But with acronym use, you basically want to make sure that if the acronym is used 4 or more times throughout the paper, you use the acronym. And if it's used less than 4 times, just spell it out. It just keeps your writing clearer and easier to follow. There are other rules that go along with acronyms, such as don't start a sentence with an acronym. So in that case, you would spell it out. You don't want to alternate back and forth between the acronym and the spelled out version. So if you're going to stick with an acronym, such as the CDC, you don't want to go the CDC and then in the next sentence, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the CDC. And it just, again, keeps your writing more clear if you keep everything consistent. And with the United States and US, and I just kind of wanted to throw this in here to say that U period, S period is used as an adjective, so the US military. But if you're referring to the United States, it's spelled out. Just another kind of sub part to acronym use for APA. Next, I'm going to touch a little bit on number use. So there are a lot of different rules for number use in APA. I'm going to just try to highlight the basics. Most of you probably heard numbers 10 and higher are used as numerals. This is pretty consistent, but there are, of course, exceptions. Numbers that represent time, dates, ages, scores of points on a scale, and exact sums of money are all spelled out. When you're working with schools and children, or just ages in general of your participants, you'll have 2 years old. Obviously, 2 is less than 10, so if you refer to that first rule, it kind of negates it, but you want to make sure that you know all the exceptions as well, because these may trip you up. 5 years, item 1, just some other examples. I also listed one of the biggest exception here, so when you're referring to approximations of days, months, years, etc., you want to write out the word, regardless of how many, if it's 10 or not. So approximately 3 weeks, almost 2 days, etc. Then I also listed when to spell it out. So any number that begins a sentence, title, or text heading, you want to spell it out. You don't want to end a sentence, period, space, and then have the number 41, because it just kind of throws off your writing. So you would spell out 41. So in general, APA advises you to rearrange your sentence, rework it a little bit so that you don't have to start a sentence with a numeral. They really do encourage you to avoid that. Common fractions are also spelled out, 1/3. And just universally accepted language, I've seen the Big 5 inventory, for example, the word 5 is spelled out, and that's just the common use of how it's used in the field. So I'd like to focus a large part on citations and references. This is definitely the biggest issue that I see when I'm going through and editing dissertations. There are a lot of different errors that occur with in-text citations, the reference list. I know a lot of it just kind of seems like a final step process. Okay, get your content down, get it approved. You'll address your citations and those errors later. But really, that can often give you a big headache. I recommend taking care of this ahead of time. You want to start, making sure all of your sources that you use in the text are already in your reference list and vice versa. If you're deleting sources from your text, delete them from your reference list. This really will help alleviate a big headache that could occur at the end. I've seen dissertations where, different files, different versions of the files, and they have different references on different pages, and they're not sure which is where, and that's a big headache that you definitely want to try to avoid. So I'm going to try to go over just a couple different common errors that I see, how to avoid them, different resources you can use. So the biggest thing I would have to say about references is that properly using references and citing your sources enhances and ensures your credibility as a researcher. And this is why you're all here, getting your PhDs. You want to make a difference. You want to publish your research, add it to the field, and ensure your credibility. So to start off, we'll obviously touch on plagiarism and paraphrasing. Most of you already know if you plagiarize, which is copying and pasting information from another source, not properly citing it, that's plagiarism. And this can get you expelled from the school. You won't be able to get your PhD. Other schools might not accept you. So it's definitely a big no-no because it's like cheating in the academic world. The best way to avoid this is always just cite what you're saying. If you have a statistic, an idea that's not your own, you want to always include a citation. So I'm going to touch here a little bit on in-text versus parenthetical citations. So in-text is when you have Smith date stated, whereas parenthetical would be you have your fact, your figure, etc., and then at the end of the sentence in parentheses you put author, year. So I listed 1 to 2 authors. You'll have examples for in-text would be like author and author date, parenthetical author and author date. The biggest difference here is with the in-text, you spell out the word and, A-N-D. In parenthetical, it's the ampersand sign. I definitely see a mix-up with this pretty frequently. You're rushing through, you're trying to get things done and pass and get to the next step, but it's definitely good to have an eye for this and try to catch them. These little errors might hold you back when you get to the final stages, or you might not be able to move forward with the next phase. I also listed the use of 3 to 5 authors here and how that format would show. So once you start getting 3 or more authors, you only have to mention all authors' last name at the first use of both in-text and parenthetical. So in text, you would have author, 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 parenthetical the same, and then subsequent citations you can use et al. So, and then you would use et al for both throughout the entire document. And then, of course, we have ones with 6 authors or more. You don't have to list all the authors' names. At that point, there's so many authors that it just gets a little bogged down, and you don't want to have the reader just sitting here like reading 10, 15 different authors, and they don't even care about the point of your sentence then. So for APA, you want to just use et al if there's more than 6 authors. For citations with less than 6 authors but more than 2, as I've already said, you want to make sure both your parenthetical and in-text citations, you list all names. And then I have a little example here, author stated, and then you would have your sentence 2 would say something, and then there's the parenthetical, and then when you're moving on back to the author, you use et al at that point. The reference list also gives us a lot of fun problems. Again, this is something you want to address up front. When you're going through your resources, when you're first starting your research, most of your references are from your lit review. So you want to really focus on that and make sure you're citing properly, you're well documenting your sources, you're having all the information now, because having to go back and find it all later, again, like I said, it's a big headache. Say you have a reference list, we'll just say 100 sources. I've seen a lot, but say you have 100 sources. That's a lot of sources to go back and have to find retrieval information or page numbers. You literally have to go back through all of those journals, try to find, okay, where did I find this source? And, so you just want to take care of these things up front. I'm sure I could go on. But again, this also ensures your credibility as a researcher. You want to make sure you have all of this taken care of, that you know what you're doing, and publishing a great work for your field. So I have a couple different examples here. Journal, article, book, reference with more than 7 authors. These are pretty basic. There are a lot more different types of references, dissertations, magazine articles, instruments, and all of those are listed in the APA manual, or of course you can hire an APA editor to help you double check those. But journal article, we have author, date, title, equally amazing journal, page numbers, DOI numbers retrieved from. These are the different elements that make up a journal article reference entry. Common errors that I see are just people missing the periods after the first and second letters of the names, the commas before the ampersand, and it's always ampersand in the reference list. It's never spelled out as and, at least beginning. Sometimes things will vary, but generally speaking, it's always ampersand in like the beginning section of your reference. Then we have book. Books are very basic. It's just italics text for the title. And then you have the location of the publisher. You need both the city and state abbreviation, publisher name. Keep publisher names short, so if it's Stage Publications, it's just Stage. If it's something publisher, you would just, include the first name. And then I have just an example of when you have more than 7 authors. Again, you don't want to sit here and list out 15 authors' names. It just takes up a lot of space. It bogs down the reader. They get the point. So what you do is, for APAs, you list the first 6, and then you put 3 periods and ellipses, and then you put the name of the last author of all the authors that are with that source. And then you just go on with your source from there, date, name. This is another book. Well, it's not. It's fictional, but this is another book. Another big thing with your reference list is you want to always alphabetize your reference list entries, starting with A, all the way through Z. Sometimes these get really easily mixed up because authors' names look similar, have similar first letters, but it definitely shows that you went an extra step to sit and make sure it truly is alphabetized. Again, this is something that you could get held back on, and it's something very simple to take care of too. One of the biggest things I cannot emphasize enough is cross-checking your references with the text. You could do this every chapter. You could do this at the end of your proposal. I always do it when I'm editing dissertations. We usually do, if it's not a full edit at one time, it'll be an edit at the proposal stage and then an edit of 4 and 5. But most of your references are going to be with the proposal anyways because it's a literature review. So it's really good, again, to take care of this ahead of time. So when you're cross-checking with the text, I'm not sure if any of you have used the navigation pane in Microsoft Word. You would hit Control F, brings up the navigation pane to the left usually. And then you can just put in the author's name and try to find them throughout the text. This is just the method that I generally use. There are different ways. You could print out your dissertation and print out your reference list and cross-check it that way. But really what you want to make sure is you've properly cited everything. Everything in your reference list matches the text and vice versa. If you mix up dates or forget to add a couple authors' names, that reduces your credibility. Again, you're not properly citing your sources. So who is to believe that your research is correct? Again, so you want to cross-check the reference list with the text and vice versa. Next, I want to touch a little bit on DOI numbers. This is something new in the field of research. Before, you didn't have to use a direct object model identifier. Now it's required for APA. Basically, any online source that you have, it has to include retrieval information. So this could include a DOI number or a URL. The URL could be the homepage of the journal, again, International Journal of Medicine. You would do http://ijm.com or whatever it is. You can use the URLs, but the DOIs are recommended, and I have here that DOI numbers are like a passport. If you have your DOI number, you're pretty much golden. You can go anywhere and do anything. Not really, but that's kind of how that works. So, oops, sorry guys. I just wanted to bring up this link for you. If it loads, and we'll go here. APA Style Blog does have a website as well that explains the DOI system, how it works, shows examples. There's kind of just 2 basics. There's a DOI : 10 period numbers and slashes and things, or the HTTP : //. There are also incorrect uses. You just want to make sure you're not mashing them together, as they say. So So you don't want to have retrieve from and then a DOI number, because retrieve from indicates a URL. We'll proceed. Another link that's really great for you to use is the Crossref database. So the Crossref database, it houses all DOI numbers. So basically, you have your reference list. Say you're missing 10 articles or missing your retrieval information, and your committee says you have to find all this, or we won't publish your document. The Crossref database, you can basically go here. You would paste the title of your document and hit search. And if it has a DOI number, it will show up, and it'll give you all the information as well. So if you're missing page numbers and you have the DOI, or you just have the journal title, just paste it and it'll give you all the information. It's a pretty great tool to use, and you definitely want to keep this in your back pocket moving forward with your dissertation. So the reference list, again, it's a pretty thorough process. You want to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and getting everything taken care of ahead of time. If you come to the end of your dissertation and your references are a mess, it will hold you up, and sometimes it will take a lot of time to do. Again, you can reach out to an APA editor, but there's only so much they can do. There might be sources that you found from a database that the editor doesn't have access to, because you have to literally take each source and search for it on the database. And again, it just becomes a big headache. So I cannot reiterate enough, as this is probably the biggest mistake I see is with citations. So now we went over a lot of different aspects of APA editing, and there are still many more that can be covered, which is why I'd like to hear some questions, try to answer some of your questions. If you have questions in the future, feel free to email us at info@statisticsolutions.com, or if you're interested in a quote, anything like that. So we just have a few questions I'd like to go over. So for anthropomorphism, we had a question about detailed guidelines with examples and corrections that you would recommend when approaching anthropomorphism. So when you have the study found, that's, again, I know I say that a lot, but I see it a lot in dissertations when I'm reading through them. The study found limited results for the data, something of that sort. The problem here is that a study cannot find something. And it's also, I mean, for those of you who aren't very familiar with anthropomorphism, your eyes aren't trained to scan a document and look for it. There are different proofing tools in Microsoft Word. Again, it just kind of depends on the version you have. The newest version of Microsoft Word deleted a lot of their editing tools, which is very sad. So sometimes the older versions are better. If you go into proofing options, you can usually choose stylistic options such as passive voice and anthropomorphism. And what this will do is it will give you those blue and red squiggly underlines when there's an error. So it kind of helps when you're editing. You see, okay, this is passive voice, and you don't have to think about it. So in terms of corrections that you can make with anthropomorphism, if you're referring to your study, again, insert yourself. The researcher found, I found. While I was working, with my results, the data can't. So there's a gray area before I get into this. So there is a little bit of a gray area with anthropomorphism, and again, it depends on your committee. You could have the data show that, or the data reveal. Technically, and in my professional opinion, I would not consider that anthropomorphism, because they do show, especially if you've got a table showing your data, revealing the results. That's not really anthropomorphism, but you still might get dinged on it. Some people are very nitpicky when you get to the form and style at the end of your dissertation. So again, ways to correct would just be putting the doer of action in the sentence. It kind of relates back to passive voice. Just making sure that you're not referring to abstract things as having power or actions. Another question that we have here, so when we refer to an idea proposed by another researcher years ago, do we differentiate between whether the idea still holds present tense or not past tense? That's definitely a good question, because there is some variation. I mean, you want to have fluidity with your writing. You want it to read well, and the reader be able to follow. So there are times when you're making general statements, and it's good to use the present tense. Throughout your research, you might say, researchers have revealed, that it's still an ongoing process. It's not, you know, you haven't stopped revealing things, or, you know, depends on your study. But so that's one way where you can kind of like get around that. So when you're talking about, you know, another researcher and an idea that they had, you still want to keep it in the past tense. I think the biggest error with this is when you're going back and forth between tenses, it might get confusing to the reader if you're referring to yourself in your own study or that of another researcher, which is the biggest reason why they suggest keeping it in past tense. Even if the idea still holds true, it was their idea. So I guess it would just depend how you word your sentence, in all honesty. If you're using a parenthetical citation, so you're not saying so-and-so found or so-and-so created this theory, and you're just talking about the theory, you know, this models, I'd like to say shows, but I'm afraid of using anthropomorphism, but, you know, the model shows, or the model presents. Yeah, people are still using this model. It's not, you know, it's not an archaic model, or, you know, whichever you're referring to. So there are times when you can use it in present tense. Sorry if my answer is a little vague, but it really just kind of depends on a sentence-by-sentence basis. But basically, if you're referring, you know, to the researcher, Smith found, past tense. But if you're saying, you know, if it's like an ongoing theory, it potentially can be in present tense. All right, well, if anyone has any questions, this concludes my webinar for today. Again, you can feel free to access this at any time. It's online for free. If you have any questions, you can email us at info@statisticsolutions.com.